Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with the next chapter of A. Edward Newton's This Book Collecting Game, and it is titled Humour and Pathos of Dr. Johnson's Dictionary. We are apt to think of this great book as the work of a pious, not over-clean old scholar, much given to talk and tea and somewhat too fond of abusing people. It will come, therefore, as a surprise to some to learn that the dictionary was the work of an obscure young man. I'm quoting Dr. Burney, Fanny's father, who single-handed and alone began it when he was little more than 36 years of age. That he had completed it before he had received any degree from any university, that he kept back the title page until the authorities at Oxford had time to confer upon him a small degree, that of Master of Arts, that it was many years later that finally and forever he became Dr. Johnson. It was Robert Dodsley, the publisher, who first made the suggestion that Johnson should undertake the work. But Johnson told Boswell that he had long thought of himself, and it was another publisher, Andrew Miller, who, associated with Dodsley and others, carried on the negotiations which led to Johnson's receiving £1,575 for the complete work, out of which he was to pay the expenses of his 6 amanuensis while the book was in progress. It was not much, but Johnson never complained. He said he hated a complainer, and years later, when Boswell remarked that he was sorry he had not received much for his work, his reply was, "I am sorry too," but it was very well. The booksellers are generous, liberal-minded men. They are the true patrons of literature. Johnson, when he made his bargain with the booksellers, expected that he would be able to complete the work in about 3 years, and when a friend pointed out that it took the French Academy, which consisted of 40 members, 40 years to compile its dictionary, replied, "This then is the proportion. 40 times 40 is 1600, as 3 is to 1600, so is the proportion of an Englishman to a Frenchman." But it took him in fact 7 years. When he first began his labours, he was living in Holborn, but he soon took a large house, still standing at 17 Gough Square, just off Fleet Street, in the garret of which, fitted up like a rude counting house, he carried to completion his work. William Strahan, the printer of the dictionary, had his printing establishment not far off, and it was to be near him that Johnson indulged himself with the most commodious residence he ever had. And moreover, had he not just been promised £1,500, which he may have thought a magnificent sum? Poor fellow, he little thought that after the completion of his great undertaking he would be arrested for a debt of £5 18s, which amount he was to borrow from Samuel Richardson, the author of Pamela, and thus free himself from the bailiffs. I've always thought it curious that Samuel Johnson never met Benjamin Franklin. Both were living in London at the same time, and both were intimate friends of Strahan's, to whom, it may be remembered, Franklin addressed one of his cleverest letters. One is permitted to wonder what would have happened at a meeting of the wisest and wittiest American that ever lived, with the wisest and wittiest Englishman of his time. I believe it has not yet been decided what takes place when an irresistible force meets an immovable body. It is rather curious, too, that although Johnson affected to dislike Scotchmen, practically all who were concerned with the dictionary were Scotch. 5 out of 6 of his amanuenses were, as were also Miller, his publisher-in-chief, and Strahan. Miller must have been sorely tried by Johnson's lack of punctuality, for we are told that when the work was finally done and the last sheet brought to him, he exclaimed, "Thank God, I have done with him." Johnson, on being told this, replied with a smile, "I am glad that he thanks God for anything." 8 years before the dictionary was published, Johnson had printed what he called the plan of a dictionary, addressed to the Earl of Chesterfield. It was an elaborate outline of what he hoped to accomplish by his work. The noble lord paid no attention to it until, on the eve of publication, Dodsley informed him that after many years of toil, the book was about to make its appearance, and no doubt reminded him that the plan had been addressed to him, and perhaps suggested that if he expected the work to be dedicated to him, it was time for him to make some sign of his approval. Chesterfield took the hint and wrote 2 letters to the world, which were fulsome in their flattery. In one he said, in times of confusion, "We must choose a dictator. I give my vote for Mr. Johnson, and I hereby declare that I make a total surrender of all my rights and privileges in the English language as a free-born British subject to said Mr. Johnson during the term of his dictatorship. Nay, more, I will not only obey him like an old Roman as my dictator, but like a modern Roman I will implicitly believe in him as my Pope and hold him to be infallible." This, it will be admitted, was very handsomely said, But in between the time when the plan was published and the dictionary completed, something had happened. Chesterfield had totally neglected the lexicographer, who was indeed the proudest man in England. "Aye, sir," said Johnson when Boswell taxed him with it, "but mine was defensive pride." "And," continued Johnson, "after making great professions, he had, for many years, taken no notice of me, and when my dictionary was coming out, he fell to scribbling in the world about it." But Johnson, although he defined himself as a lexicographer, and a lexicographer as a harmless drudge, was not to be beguiled, and seizing his pen, he wrote what is probably the most smashing letter in all of literature. "7 years, my lord, have now passed since I waited in your outward room, or was repulsed from your door, during which times I have been pushing on my work through difficulties of which it is useless to complain, without one act of assistance, one act of encouragement, or one smile of favour. The notice which you have been pleased to take of my labours, had it been early, had it been kind, but it has been delayed till I am indifferent and cannot enjoy it, till I am solitary and cannot impart it, till I am known and do not want it." It is a great letter, too long to quote in its entirety, and it must have crushed utterly a man less vain and complacent than the man who wrote it, than the man to whom it was addressed. Carlyle called it a blast of doom, proclaiming into the ears of Lord Chesterfield, and through him to the listening world, that a patronage should be no more. It was indeed a declaration of independence. The book appeared in 2 large folio volumes on February 20th, 1755. It was a time of profound depression for Johnson. He had, as he said, devoted the labour of years to the honour of my country, that we may no longer yield the palm of philology without a contest to the nations of the continent. But, he also said, "I have protracted my work till most of those whom I wish to please have sunk into the grave, and success and miscarriage are empty sounds. I therefore dismiss the book with frigid tranquillity, having little to fear or hope from censure or from praise." In this brief paper I shall not attempt to conceal the fact that I regard the present great esteem which the world, our world that is, has for Dr. Johnson, his life and his works with some amusement. It may be that I am to some extent responsible for it. At any rate, if you enter any good bookshop in England and ask for any book by Dr. Johnson in first edition, you will almost certainly be met with a sad shake of the head and the remark that Johnson in first editions is almost impossible except at prohibitive prices, and that this advance is due to the American demand. And then you may be told, as I have been more than once, that a man in Philadelphia is largely responsible for Johnson's being collected. Before he began to write about him, Boswell's Life, a big ugly book in 2 volumes, was hard to sell at 3 guineas. There was no more demand for Johnson's dictionary than there was for Fox's Martyrs, and now you can't get them fast enough. 40 years ago, my friends used to say, by way of disconcerting me, "Eddie, tell us something about Dr. Johnson," and usually I did so, but I had just fallen under the spell of Boswell. I had just fallen under the spell of Boswell, and was by way, as far as a man with treacherous memory could be, of knowing him by heart. It is a happy possession, and affords one an apt quotation in every conceivable discussion, and upon every possible occasion. Have you a difficult business matter to discuss? Discuss it after a good dinner, and not before. Remember what Dr. Johnson says, "Sir, a good dinner lubricates business." Since then I have met many Johnsonians, and have come to believe that all Johnsonians are good fellows, cruel men, as Dr. Johnson would say. And as the years passed, and I came to know wiser and better Johnsonians than myself, this suspicion became conviction. Finally came the desire to own, and in some measure to know, the books of the great lexicographer himself. But I remember that my copy of the first edition of Boswell's Life was purchased for $20. A good copy cannot be had for less than 300. And the first Raslas I ever bought cost me but 10, and the last 200. And as for the dictionary, well, Mrs. Thrale Pizzoli's copy, probably given her by Johnson, with her inscription and a fine holograph letter from the lexicographer, cost me only $60, and a fine copy and boards, uncut, $35. Taking a census of the Johnson dictionaries now in my library, I find that I have all 6 copies in first editions, besides a copy which was once Charles Dickens, with his notes therein, and an excellent, shall I say, common or garden copy, a reprint from the author's last folio edition in 1 volume for easy reference, which was E. Copey Mitchell's. And we have here reading from top to bottom: Charles Dickens's copy, Mrs. Thrale's copy, Mrs. Vesey's copy, a common or garden copy, and a copy in boards uncut. Why so many? Let me explain. One copy I bought to show people to whom one copy is as good as another. This saves wear and tear on the copies I highly value. Two come in this way. On the 15th of February, 1926, my great friend and fellow Johnsonian, Mr. R.B. Adam of Buffalo, had a sale at the Anderson Galleries in New York of a portion of his library. Not of his wonderful Johnson collection, but of books of which he had tired, or which did not fit into the period which he had made peculiarly his own. With the idea of paying him homage, I gave a little dinner in New York, the first night of the sale, to a small group of friends and booksellers' friends also. It was a speedy affair, including speeches. We were all at the table just 1 hour and 15 minutes, and it may be remembered by those present that Mr. O.N.D. Young, that accomplished gentleman who, in his company with General Dawes, brought order out of chaos in Germany, finally, signally failed to secure a hearing at our little dinner party, whereupon the meeting adjourned to the auction room. The sale had just begun, and we took our seats. My wife joined my friend Mr. William J. Turner, who had been one of my party, and I took a seat in the back part of the room next to Walter Hill, the Chicago bookseller, and immediately bought a book I didn't want, just to prevent him from getting it. He didn't want it either. We were in just the form that brings joy to the heart of an auctioneer. The books were fine, and the sale went merrily. After a time, a copy of the dictionary, first edition, 2 volumes, old calf, was put up, and I saw at once that it was not Adam's best copy. It might be called a spare. The bidding started at $50, went to $150, and then the then proper price for the book, then more slowly to $300, and finally it was knocked down at $325 to, of all people in the world, my wife, who wanted it as a souvenir of a pleasant evening. Whereupon, discovering that my friend Turner was the runner-up, he wanted the book for the same reason my wife did, and would have paid any amount had he not discovered that he was in competition with Mrs. Newton. I rose and assured all present that there was obviously no knockout in the room, and the sale went on. Subsequently, in talking over the events of the evening, which is one of the delights of a good auction, Mr. Turner asked me to watch my chance and pick up for him a good copy of the dictionary, which I promised to do. Several months later, in the catalogue of an English bookseller, I noticed a copy, Mrs. Vesey's copy, priced at £40, and I at once cabled for it. Mr. Vesey was a member of the club, founded by Dr. Johnson, was elected through the influence of Edmund Burke, and it was Mrs. Vesey who gave the famous blue stocking parties. She didn't wear blue stockings herself. A man by the name of Stillingfleet wore them. Mrs. Vesey's were what they were, certainly not the skin-colored kind, so much in evidence today. Her copy of the dictionary then was one which Dr. Johnson might have seen in the library in her house in Clarges Street, and conceivably the not too Reverend Lawrence Sterne might have referred to it to settle some disputed point in conversation. For it will be remembered that he was much with Mrs. Vesey, on whom he was very sweet, as he was on every other pretty and attractive woman he met. Here, then, was a copy of the dictionary with a provenance of which anyone might be proud, and I certainly hoped to get it. But in due course I received a letter from the bookseller saying that he was sorry he could not send it to me, the desired item, as an hour before my cable arrived he had received a cable from Mr. Adam of Buffalo, to whom the volume must be dispatched. That settles that, I said. But not so. A month later, a bulky package arrived at my office. Opening it, I found Mrs. Vesey's copy of the dictionary, and a wonderful letter from Adam telling me that he had immediately made up his mind not to take my wife's money for his copy of the dictionary. She had paid for it out of the household account, and we had been living on short rations, that this was a better copy, that it had once belonged to a famous lady, and had her signature and bookplate, that it was bound in 3 volumes with a separate title page for the 3rd volume, to be easier for reference, and finally, that I was to take the copy which had once been his, and, upon some suitable occasion, to present it with his compliments to the Shakespeare Society of Philadelphia, over which my friend Dr. Furness presides with such distinction. Here, then, was a very pretty amenity which Johnson defines as an agreeableness of situation, and such are not of unfrequent occurrence among those who play at this book-collecting game. It is a wonderful book, It is a wonderful book, is Dr. Johnson's dictionary. And think of the circumstances under which it was composed, with, as its author says, little assistance of the learned, without any patronage of the great, not in the soft obscurities of retirement or under academic bowers, but amidst inconvenience and distraction, in sickness and in sorrow. What do you read, my lord? Words, 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 replied Hamlet. Buckle read it through to enlarge his vocabulary, so did Browning, and no other dictionary can be read with such pleasure and profit, for in it Johnson gave, and for the first time, quotations from esteemed authors, illustrating the use of words he defined. He fitted himself for this mighty task by diligent reading, underscoring with a pencil the selections which were subsequently copied out on slips of paper by his amanuenses. His marvelous memory, of course, stood him in good stead. Well, the range of his reading was boundless, and yet he always spoke and thought of himself as lazy. One day, entering Mrs. Thrale's drawing-room and seeing her dog asleep before the fire, he remarked, "Presto, you are, if possible, a lazier dog than I am." Every reader of Boswell will remember the kindly interest that Johnson took in Fanny Burney, how he called her his little Burney and extolled her first and only good novel to the skies, saying it was superior to the work of Fielding and equal to that of Richardson. I've always thought this excessive eulogy was by way of return for the interest her father had shown him at the time the dictionary was published. Charles Burney, not yet the distinguished doctor of music, which he subsequently became, was then living in Norfolk. He does not appear to have known Johnson personally, but to have made his acquaintance through his ramblers. When the dictionary was announced in the newspapers, he wrote Johnson a kindly letter, and offered to subscribe for 6 copies for himself and his friends. I have an autograph letter in Johnson's hand, in which he says, "I was bred a bookseller and have not forgotten my trade." But he was not soliciting orders for his book, and asked that Mr. Burney direct his inquiries to Mr. Dodsley, because it was by his recommendation that he was employed in the work. But note the modesty of the great man. "When you have looked into my dictionary, if you find faults, I shall endeavour to mend them. If you find none, I shall think you blinded by kind partiality." Then followed farther letters on the subject, and seemingly Mr. Burney was insistent that he be sent a prospectus, order form, and the like, what we would today call literature on the subject. A letter has recently come into my hands, from which I must quote, as it shows only too clearly Johnson's habit of procrastination, and at least one reason for his depression. This letter is addressed from Gough Square to Mr. Burney, and reads in part, "Sir, that I may show myself sensible of your favours, and not commit the same fault a second time, I make haste to answer the letter which I received this morning. The truth is, the other likewise was received, and I wrote an answer, but being desirous to transmit you some proposals and receipts, I waited till I could find a convenient conveyance, and day was passed after day, till another thing drove it from my thoughts. Yet not so, but that I remember with great pleasure your commendation of my dictionary. Your praise was welcome, not only because I believe it was sincere, but because praise has been very scarce. A man of your candour will be surprised when I tell you that among all my acquaintance, there were only 2 who upon the publication of my book did not endeavour to depress me with threats of censure from the public, or with objections learned from those who had learned them from my own preface. Yours is the only letter of goodwill that I have yet received, though indeed I am promised something of that sort from Sweden." Can we wonder at the great man's depression? Years of work rewarded by poverty and neglect, and 1 letter of goodwill and a promise of something from Sweden. The day of the patron was past, and the day of the logger roller had not yet come. Slowly and by degrees, Johnson's dictionary became a bestseller, and a bestseller it remained for almost a century. "What I like about your dictionary, Mr. Johnson," said one old lady to him, "is that it has no naughty words in it." "Madame, I hope you have not been looking for them," replied the lexicographer. And to another who remarked that for steady reading it changes the subject pretty often, Johnson admitted that it had that fault in common with most dictionaries. Again, to someone who said that the word ocean was omitted, he replied, "Madame, you will look for it in vain if you spell it Oshun." Garrick, his old friend and former pupil, broke into verse about it, and so marvellous an actor was the little man that his cleverness as a poet of occasional verse has never been fully recognized. Let me quote this line: "Talk of war with a Briton, he'll boldly advance, that one English soldier will beat 10 of France. Would we alter the boast from the sword to the pen, our odds are still greater our men. In the deep mines of science, though Frenchmen may toil, can their strength be compared to Locke, Newton, and Boyle? Let them raise their heroes, send forth all their powers. Their versemen and prosemen, then match them with ours. For Shakespeare and Milton, like gods in the fight, have put their whole drama and epic to fight. In satires, epistles, and odes would they cope. Their numbers retreat before Dryden and Pope. And Johnson, well armed like a hero of yore, has beat 40 French and will beat 40 more. Some of Johnson's definitions have given the world amusement since the day of publication. Let me give a few examples. A blister sounds worse than it is. He defines it as a pustule formed by raising the cuticle from the cutis and filled with serious blood. Buxom, now understood to mean plump and comely, was defined thus. It originally signified obedient. Before the reformation of the bride in the marriage service promised to be obedient and buxom in bed and at board. Alas, the word has gone, and obey is going, we are told. I am against change in any form and would not put them both back. Johnson's opportunity of studying wild animals at close range was slight, even had his eyesight been good. A cam leopard is an Abyssinian animal taller than an elephant, but not so thick. He is so named because he has a neck and head like a camel. He is spotted like a pard is a leopard, but his spots are white upon a red ground. The Italians call him a giraffa. Cant was particularly offensive to Johnson, and he was frequently heard to say, when in a heated argument with a friend, "Clear your mind of cant," which was a whining pretension to goodness in formal and affected terms. A chicken was, among other things, a term for a young girl. You have seen a chicken flap its wings, hence flapper, the word of today. And I have observed as I get older that flappers get better looking and wear fewer clothes. Much danger lurks in a cough. It is a convulsion of the lungs, velicicated by some sharp seriosity. Mrs. William Lowell Putnam of Boston has written a priceless poem, and a poem is Sense Enriched by Sound, which I wish Dr. Johnson could have known. To cough and sneeze will spread disease, so does spit, take care of it. Perhaps because Johnson was himself an essayist, he does not rate that form of composition highly. An essay he calls a loose sally of the mind, an irregular, indigested piece, not a regular and orderly composition. The thought of death in any form was at all times abhorrent to him, hence we are not surprised to learn that death's door is now a low phrase. The definition of excise is one of which the doctor is most famous, a hateful tax levied upon commodities, and adjudged, not by the common judges of property, but wretches hired by those to whom excise is paid. This definition roused to fury the commissioners of excise, who sought opinion of the Attorney General, afterward Lord Mansfield, whether or not it was libellous. He thought that it was, but wisely suggested that the author be allowed an opportunity of altering his definition. It was not changed. One definition of favourite is a mean wretch whose whole business is by any means to please. Grub Street, originally the name of a street in Moorsfield in London, much inhabited by writers of small histories, dictionaries, and temporary poems. The street still exists, but it is now Milton Street, not named after the poet, as is generally supposed, but after a builder of that name. Leeward and windward, though of opposite meaning, are both described as towards the wind. A lexicographer is a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the significance of words. Johnson was not above making fun of himself as well as others. Network has indeed a portentous definition. It is anything reticulated or decussiated at equal distances with interstices between the intersections. Oats is equally famous, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. Very true, was the retort of Lord Elibank. And where will you find such men and such horses? Pastern is defined as the knee of a horse. It later led to question how this slip was made. Johnson's reply is historic. Ignorance, madame, pure ignorance. And his definition of patriotism, that is to say, reform, is not in the dictionary, but it should be worn as a sort of badge by every would-be reformer, the last refuge of a scoundrel. A pension is an allowance made to anyone without an equivalent. In England, it is generally understood to mean pay given to a state hireling for treason to his country. When subsequently Johnson accepted a pension from the king, this definition was brought up against him, but it moved him not an iota. I wish, he said with a laugh, that my pension had been twice as large, that they could make twice as much fun of it. A poetess is a she-poet. I am afraid this is not a very gallant definition, despite Perhaps Johnson had in mind Anna Seward, alias the Swan of Lichfield, as she loved to hear herself called. A stock jobber is a low wretch who gets money by buying and selling shares in the funds. He should now say stockbroker, and it will occur to some that the definition is not obsolete. Tory is a cant term derived, Johnson supposes, from an Irish word signifying a savage, but he indulges himself in one of his rolling periods by adding, one who adheres to the ancient constitution of the state and the apostolical hierarchy of the Church of England. No one doubts that Johnson was a Tory. Whig is defined as the name of a faction, and in conversation he did not hesitate to say the first Whig was the devil. But it was in the grammar of the English tongue that Johnson made his most risible slip, where he says H seldom, perhaps never, begins any but the first syllable. Wilkes the scamp pronounced on this instantly with a sarcastic remark, the author of this observation must be a man of quick apprehension and of a most comprehensive genius. Johnson no doubt felt the shaft, but malignancy, if it is to be kept in the air, must, like the shuttlecock, be struck from both sides. Johnson let it pass, and the sneer was forgotten. It was not until the fourth edition that he paid his compliments to Wilkes in this sentence. It sometimes begins in the middle or final syllable in words compounded as in blockhead. Johnson would never permit anyone to get his goat, as we would now say. The list might be longer, but to what end? Only, as Johnson said, that the few wild blunders might, for a time, furnish folly with laughter. So much for his definitions. Scholars say that his etymologies are defective. Macaulay calls them wretched, and it may be that they are. I hate to quote Carlyle, that dyspeptic prophet. But, after all, no one has a juster appreciation of Johnson than he. Listen to him. Had Johnson left nothing but his dictionary, one might have traced there a great intellect, a genuine man. Looking to its clearness of definition, its genuine solidity, honesty, insight, and successful method, it may be called the best of all dictionaries. There is in it a kind of architectural nobleness. It stands like a great, solid, square-built edifice, finished symmetrically, complete. You judge that a true builder did it. Johnson's dictionary was based on a work compiled and published in 1721 by Nathaniel Bailey. Bailey's dictionary is a mere list of words. Johnson had an interleaved copy of it made and worked therefrom. This book was exhibited at Stationers' Hall in London so recently as 1912. Who has it now? Johnson's own copy of the last edition of his dictionary to be published in his lifetime is now one of the treasures of the John Rylands Library in Manchester. I wonder whether this is the copy that at the sale of Johnson's library after his death in Mr. Christie's great room in Pall Mall brought the magnificent sum of 13 shillings. But then it was disfigured by his notes, and we must remember too that his first folio of Shakespeare, similarly disfigured, brought only 22. And consider the price of the smallest scrap of Johnsonian today. Let us allow our imagination to play for a moment and fancy that the tools of Johnson's trade, his library, could be reassembled and resold in New York City tomorrow at Mitchell Kearnley's great room. What competition there would be with Dr. R. and Brick Row and Dunster House, to say nothing of the wells of English undefiled, and Drake and Beyer and Walter Hill, all of the talent, with unlimited bids from Adam and Isham and Young and Clark and Porzheimer and Hurst, and all the lesser fry of Johnsonians, who are numbered as the sands of the sea. I should have at such a sale just as much chance as a canary at a cat's congress. And yet, doctor, if I did not set your ball rolling, I certainly gave it acceleration. They tell me that there are Johnson collectors in England. Are there, forsooth? And they put a price of £5 on your life of Boswell. We of the plantations put it at 50, and it is worth 100. It is the greatest biography in the world, and the best part of it, a taste of its quality, was published the year after your death, and is known as a tour of the Hebrides. It is the quintessence of Boswell. Why is all the world Johnsoniassimus? He's invented a word here. Johnsonianismus. Today, Johnson had, according to Taine, the manners of a beadle and the inclinations of a constable. Every Johnsonian will have a different answer, and they will be right. This is Austin Dobson's opinion. Turn now to his writings. I grant in his tales that he made little fishes talk vastly like whales. I grant that his language was rather aesthetic, nay, even to put the thing plainly, dogmatic. But read him for style and dismiss from your thoughts the crowd of compilers who copied his faults. Say, where is their English so full and so clear, so weighty, so dignified, manly, sincere? So strong in expression, conviction, persuasion, so prompt to take color from place and occasion, so widely removed from the doubtful and tentative, so truly, and in the best sense, argumentative? You may talk of your Burkes and your Gibbons so clever, but I hark back to him with a Johnson forever, and I feel as I muse on his ponderous figure, though he's great in this age, in the next he'll grow bigger. A happy coincidence enables me to display to my friends an important manuscript of which not every Johnsonian knows the existence. In 1772, Johnson, then being in his 63rd year, wrote in Latin a long ode addressed to himself with a Greek title which translates, Know Thyself. In it he compares himself, and to his disadvantage, with the great French scholar Scaliger, and says that indolence and a penury of mind cooperate to prevent him from taking on another task, if indeed he has the requisite knowledge. Instead of which he confesses that he seeks at midnight clubs where wit with noise conspires, where comus reveals, and where wine inspires. I am quoting from a translation. Relief from the dull melancholy which at all times dogs his steps. The poem closes, What then remains? Must I in slow decline to mute's inglorious ease old age resign? Or bold ambition kindling in my breast attempt some arduous task? Or were it best brooding o'er lexicons to pass the day, and in that labor drudge my life away? How he answered the self-imposed question is beyond the scope of this paper. Finally, and I seem to hear the sigh of relief which is occasionally audible in church at the end of a long sermon, I wish to dip my flag to the latest descendant of Dr. Johnson's genius, the concise Oxford Dictionary. I owe that colossal monument of worldly learning, the New English Dictionary, now fully completed, but its possession is a species of swank. Dr. Johnson once called a certain man good and pious because, although he had not entered a church for many years, he never passed one without pulling off his hat. And if the doctor continued in the same gracious manner, were he to enter my library, he might think kindly of me, although he would at once detect that I am not a scholar, because I have a copy of the New English Dictionary on my shelves. I never pass the book, and I raise it more frequently than I enter it, without raising my hat. Unless one has made a book, one has no idea how much toil enters into the feeblest publication, and I am, I think, within bounds when I say that for sheer labor, learning, and scholarship, the New English Dictionary is the greatest literary achievement that the world has ever seen. No one should attempt to undertake a serious piece of literary work without it. It is, in brief, an immense series of essays alphabetically arranged upon what we call the English language. Several people sought to prepare themselves for a life of authorship by reading Dr. Johnson's dictionary through from cover to cover, and no doubt they were rewarded for doing so. But what shall be said of a man who, knowing how to spell it, looks up the simple word run in this great book? He will never run again. He may walk, loiter, crawl, creep, strut, march, parade. He may, in short, do anything that expresses motion on earth, but never run. Festina lente will, therefore, be his motto. He will feel that to run is to set in motion forces that will never stop. This is only another way of saying that the essays on this simple little word cover many large pages, 3 columns to a page of fine print. Few individuals except scholars really require the New English Dictionary. But every school of the higher grade, every club, college, university, in brief, every place where men and women congregate and use language, not merely crudely to express their thoughts and their wants, but as an instrument on which they perform with what skill they may, should be possessed of a copy. Looking at this great book, it is a book in many large volumes. One wonders who would dare attempt its condensation into a single small volume, the concise Oxford. Yet it has been done, and again into one still smaller, and into another especially adapted for us Americans. but the NED remains what it was when, more than 50 years ago, its building was begun, not for profit but for glory, a tribute to the scholarship of the English people of the world, but chiefly, of course, to the learning of the great Oxford scholars who have dedicated their lives to its perfection. But the concise is ever at hand. It is a masterpiece of reference and condensation. Derivations do not much interest me, but I like to have some idea of the meaning of the words I am using, and as I dictate more than I write, I have forgotten, if indeed I ever knew, how to spell. Every foreign word that has worked its way into our language is given in it, and one small joke, for which I love it. I can imagine several learned old gentlemen sitting and sipping their port after a dinner at the high table in some Oxford college, debating whether the joke might be permitted. Wisely they agreed that it might. Turn to the word wing. It is defined one of the limbs or organs by which the flight of a bird, bat, insect, angel, etc. is effected. How do we know that angels fly? Who ever saw one? This is no place for skepticism. The authority of the greatest of universities is not to be challenged by an insect. And that brings us to the end of this chapter on Dr. Johnson's dictionary. And I'll be back soon with the next chapter titled The Format of the English Novel, and we are fast approaching the end of the book here.